There is something slightly strange about the way we tell the story of the Viking Age. It supposedly began in the year 793 with Scandinavian raiders attacking the monastery in Lindisfarne, England. And supposedly the Viking Age ended in 1066 with the Berserker at Stamford Bridge. I think most of you have heard about that story. Both of these events occurred in England. And at least to me, this raises an obvious question. Why should an age in Scandinavian history begin and end according to what happened in England? Because, of course, nobody living in Scandinavia at that particular time in 793 woke up a morning and thought to themselves, well, the Viking Age has begun. History doesn't work that way, obviously. And I think the reason why we use 793 as the starting position is that the attack on Lindisfarne was quite dramatic. It was especially dramatic if you happened to be a monk at that particular time in England. But in reality, Scandinavian sailors had been crossing the North Sea and the Baltic long before the year 793. And the trade was already connected between Scandinavia and places like Ribe, Dorestad, and York. And we know that Norwegian whetstones were being exported across the North Sea in the 700s. So ships traveled regularly between Scandinavia and the British Isles before the so-called Viking Age. So when Scandinavian raiders suddenly appear in English sources in 793, the important word may actually be English, and not English as in the ethnicity, but in the word English, the language. The Northmen had not suddenly discovered ships, nor had they suddenly realized that violence was the answer for all their dreams and hopes. What changed was that these people now entered the written word of Christian England. And the thing was that since this happened in perfect alignment with this, the Christian writers, of course, noticed this and noted it down. And even though the Viking raids in England are pretty well documented, that's not a unique occasion for the Viking Age. On the other hand, we have good observations from the east as well. At Salme, the island of Saaremaa in modern Estonia, archaeologists discovered two quite extraordinary ship burials dating to around the middle of the 8th century. And this was, of course, decades before Lindisfarne and the monastery. And dozens of Scandinavian warriors had traveled across the Baltic. And they also had ships. They also had weapons and long-distance maritime networks. We know this through archaeology. And apparently, they had a rather unpleasant encounter with someone at Saaremaa, given it's a ship grave now, or boat grave. So, was this a part of the Viking Age? Maybe. but the problem begins to formulate here, because Scandinavians had in reality traveled across the Baltic long before Salme as well. And the sea was not seen as a wall dividing peoples at this time. I think that modern people tend to look at large bodies of water as a type of hindrance for, going from place to place. But in this time, water bodies were considered highways or roads, which meant that these were accessible places, and it had been considered a road for centuries, regardless if you look west or east. So, and actually, before the Viking period comes the period that I find very intriguing, and it's the Vendel period. And it's a very fascinating period. Roughly speaking, the centuries before the Viking Age, the Vendel period actually contains many of the attributes that we associate to Viking Age Scandinavia today. The Vendel Age contains of elite warrior culture and cults and magnificent weapons with state-of-the-art metallurgy and long-distance trade networks and ship burials and quite complex political centers as well, not only in Scandinavia, but throughout the Baltic Sea, actually. So, and also the shipbuilding was really progressed at this time as well. When it comes to the ships having sails or not, this is debated, but the shipbuilding was quite sophisticated at the Vendel time as well. And if you visit Gotland and look at the picture stones, which I did this last summer, please have a look at that video if you're interested. You even see these very ships depicted and the crews, the rowers and the maritime imagery long before the conventional Viking Age began. So the Viking world did not suddenly appear out of nothingness. There was actually a deep Vendel foundation prior to it. But this does not automatically mean that we should rename the Vendel period itself to the early Viking Age or something in those lines. Because if we would do that, we would run into another problem. So if we did that, how far should we backdate the Viking Age? This is a question that has to involve Beowulf in order to be answered. I know many of you have asked me to talk about Beowulf, and I will give it a brief go this time. So, the setting in Beowulf is pre-Viking Age. It's older than the Viking Age. And yet, it contains Scandinavian kings and sea voyages and quite a lot of warfare and raids against continental Europe. Rings a bell? And there's one character that is quite fascinating, Hygelac, the king of the Geats. And then there's a ruler with essentially the same name that appears in the Frankish source describing a Scandinavian raid against Frankish territory in the early 6th century, meaning around the year 516, more than 2.5 decades before Lindisfarne. So, if a Scandinavian ruler sailing overseas with armed men attacking the Franks means that someone is a Viking, We've all heard it. Viking wasn't an ethnicity, it was a verb, something you did. We give that the go. Then apparently the Viking Age started in 516, which is more or less absurd, actually. Or at least that it shows us that Viking Age cannot simply mean that Scandinavian doing violent things on boats. That's not the definition solely about the Viking Age, of course. Because they had been doing that for a long time prior to what we call the Viking Age. So that's not the only differentiator for the Viking Age, of course. And I think this is a quite important distinction actually to be made. The Viking Age as a thing was not invented by the Vikings themselves. It's a modern historical category, rather, because the archaeologists which crowned this epithet, if you will, they needed a system to box in certain time periods. We have the Vendel era, we have the Viking Age, and we have the Middle Ages, for example. And this is because we need a helicopter perspective at history sometimes. And I think that these are useful boxes, but the thing with nature is that nature does not like these boxes and very seldom operates in them. People living through these centuries, they of course experienced a continuity. It was not clear cut between the boxes as we see today when we open a history book about a certain period. A man that was born in the year 770 did not suddenly become culturally obsolete when the calendar reached 800, of course. The ships that we call Viking ships, they in reality developed gradually, and the trade networks grew gradually. And the political systems with the Ting and the things that we read about in the Eddas, they also grew gradually. And religious ideas surrounding the gods and pagan beliefs and animism, they also grew gradually. Just like Christianity didn't come in and sweep the lands of Scandinavia, it arrived gradually and was accepted gradually as well. And this is perhaps where the traditional dates becomes somewhat interesting, because around the year 800, something really is happening in Scandinavia or Fennoscandia. The Scandinavian maritime activity basically explodes, and long-distance travel grows. New political networks form that are reaching way outside of Scandinavia. Scandinavian warriors begin to repeatedly pop up across Western Europe as well. We've all heard the stories. And in the east, routes through the Baltic connecting Scandinavia with Finland, the lands of the Finnic peoples, the Baltic coast, Ladoga, sorry about that, and eventually the river system themselves towards Byzantium and the Islamic world eventually. So this is the world that will eventually produce what we refer to as the Rus. Instead of asking what was the first Viking raid, it's quite an uninteresting question really when you know the backstory to it all. I think a better question is something like, when did the northern maritime world change enough that it makes sense for us to give it a new name? You know, we have the Vendel period, the Viking Age, and the Middle Ages, for example. What moment in time was so elaborate and important to change the name of the period itself? That's a much harder question, given the things that I've just spoke about. Given that sea-raiding Scandinavians predates the Viking Age with centuries. But I think even though it's a much harder question, it's a much more interesting question. And it also matters for another reason, I believe, because the events at Lindisfarne gives us a very Western picture of the Viking Age. We have England, Ireland, Francia, raids, monasteries. But if we stand in Roslagen, which is the uncrowned place of the Vendel period, and we turn east instead of west, a different world appears. Across the Baltic lies Finland and Estonia and the Gulf of Finland and Ladoga. And the waterways that eventually led deep into Eastern Europe, those connections did not suddenly appear in the year 793 either. They have their own history and their own continuity, and probably their own logic in some aspects. And that is, my friends, where I want to go next. Because if you want to understand the Viking Age from a Fennoscandian perspective, perhaps England is not the best place to begin. I would argue it's definitely not the best place to begin. And perhaps we should begin at the Baltic shore and start rowing east and start the Austrvegr. So please join me in the upcoming series about the Austrvegr, the Eastern Way. And I'm happy for you to join me. Okay, folks. If you made it this far, I salute you. And please remember to interact with the gods of the algorithm. It's more important now than ever. Okay, have a lovely day, and I talk to you later. And as usual, Tyrdom out.